In a galaxy far from Earth on the planet Satora, a strange new discovery was about to change everything. The Zatorians were an ancient and advanced species. Their technology had cured every disease, and their science had extended their lives beyond any measure. But there was one thing the Zatorians lacked: the ability to feel true pleasure. Their bodies couldn't enjoy food, physical sensations, or even emotions the way humans did. It had been a mystery to them for centuries. That is, until now. Dr. Isa, a young and brilliant Zatorian nurse, stood in a sterile laboratory surrounded by advanced machines. She was part of a special team selected to study the newly discovered humans. For the first time, the Zatorians had made contact with another species, Earth's humans, and they had a singular question. What made these humans so alive? Why did they experience such joy and pleasure from the simplest things like food, touch, and even emotions? Isa was fascinated by this question. As a child, she had always wondered what it would feel like to experience the world like a human, to enjoy a delicious meal, to feel the warmth of a hug, to laugh uncontrollably at a joke. The Zatorians had been studying human biology for months, but the answers seemed elusive. They had gathered plenty of information, but they could never replicate the sensation humans experienced. This experiment was supposed to be different. Today, Isa and her team were going to make history. They were going to test the effects of human biology on Zatorian physiology, specifically human saliva. According to their research, saliva contained a unique set of enzymes and compounds that could possibly trigger a reaction in Zatorians. It was a small, simple sample, but it could hold the key to understanding what made humans so special. Isa carefully prepared the lab, setting up the sterile equipment needed for the experiment. Her heart raced with excitement as she prepared to conduct the test. She had volunteered to lead the experiment, and though she knew it was risky, she couldn't help but feel a surge of anticipation. She couldn't wait to see if the Zatorians would experience anything like human pleasure. The first subject, a male Zatorian volunteer named Velox, was ready. He stood tall and calm, his glowing blue skin reflecting the fluorescent lights of the lab. He had always been curious about humans, and like many of his kind, he believed that this experiment would offer insights into something truly profound. "Begin the test," Isa said, her voice steady but with a hint of excitement. She handed a small vial of human saliva to Velox, who looked at it with curiosity. He took it without hesitation, swallowing it in one quick motion. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Isa watched intently, unsure of what to expect. But then, Velox's eyes widened in disbelief. His body began to shake, and his skin glowed brighter. His breathing became shallow, and his hands trembled as he clutched the edge of the table. Isa took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. This was not what she had expected. Velox gasped, his voice trembling. "What is this feeling?" "I feel something different, alive." His words trailed off, and he collapsed onto the floor, breathing heavily. The other scientists in the room exchanged looks of shock. No one had predicted this. Velox's reaction wasn't just physical, it was emotional. His entire body seemed to be vibrating with energy, a kind of euphoric reaction that the Zatorians had never experienced before. Isa rushed to his side, kneeling down to check on him. His eyes were wide open, but there was no longer fear in them. Instead, there was a deep hunger, a desperate need for more. "I need more," Velox whispered, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what it is, but I need more of that." Isa's mind raced. She had never seen anything like this before. It wasn't just curiosity, it was addiction. The Zatorians had never experienced addiction, not in the way humans did. And now, they had tasted something that would change the course of history. But was it a blessing or a curse? Dr. Isa stood up, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had just witnessed. She hadn't expected this. She had hoped to unlock the secret to human pleasure, but instead, she had unleashed something far more dangerous. something that could have devastating consequences for both humans and Zatorians alike. And so, the experiment that began with simple curiosity was now a turning point. Isa knew that she had just uncovered something far bigger than she had ever imagined, something that could potentially alter the future of her species and of Earth. What would happen next? Only time would tell. The room was filled with a strange, heavy silence. Dr. Isa stood frozen, her mind racing after witnessing Velox's shocking reaction. She had expected something, maybe a mild reaction or some odd biological response. But nothing like this. Nothing at all. As Velox continued to lie on the floor, breathing heavily, his body twitching with what seemed like euphoric pleasure, the other Zatorian scientists stared at each other in confusion and fear. They had all been part of the same research, all of them eager to understand what made humans so alive, so different. But no one had foreseen this. No one had imagined that the simple act of consuming a tiny amount of human saliva could trigger an addictive reaction in a species that had never known addiction. "Velox, can you hear me?" Isa asked, her voice shaky, but firm as she kneeled beside the volunteer. His eyes opened slowly, but they no longer looked like the calm, controlled eyes of a Zatorian. Instead, there was something wild, desperate in them. I feel like I need more," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "I need more of it. Please, give me more." Isa recoiled slightly, her heart pounding in her chest. This was beyond anything she had expected. Zatorians did not experience cravings, not in the way humans did. They didn't have addiction problems. In fact, their bodies were engineered to function without the need for external pleasures. But this was something new. The other scientists quickly moved to help Velox, but it was clear that this wasn't a normal reaction. His body was overheating, his skin glowing brighter than usual as if responding to an unseen energy. His pulse was erratic, and he gripped his chest in distress. "This isn't normal," one of the scientists, Torek, said. This is more than just a biological reaction. It's like he's becoming obsessed." Isa nodded grimly, her thoughts racing. She knew that if this was what they thought it was, an addiction, it could have terrible consequences. Zatorians were not equipped to handle addiction. Their minds and bodies weren't designed for dependence, and the last thing she wanted was to see her entire species fall into chaos because of one simple experiment. She quickly signaled to her team to administer a calming agent to Velox, hoping to stabilize him. As the sedatives kicked in, he slowly began to relax, but his eyes remained wide, his body still trembling with desire. "We need to study this," Isa said, her voice firm, though her heart was heavy with fear. "We need to understand what's happening to him. If this is truly an addiction, then we might be facing something far bigger than we can control." The rest of the day was spent in a blur of tests and observations. Isa and her team closely monitored Velox's condition, trying to find a way to reverse the reaction. But nothing worked. Every time they removed him from the substance, any trace of human saliva or bodily fluid, his symptoms only worsened. His cravings intensified. He would beg for more, his desperation growing by the hour. By evening, the team had decided to conduct further tests. They had to know if this reaction was just a fluke or if it was a consistent phenomenon. Another volunteer, a female Zatorian named Zarnak, stepped forward, offering herself as the next subject for the experiment. Isa was hesitant, but knew they couldn't stop now. They needed answers. Zarnak consumed the same small sample of human saliva. And just like Velox, her reaction was immediate and intense. Her eyes widened, her breathing grew shallow, and she clutched at her chest, her body trembling. "I feel alive," she whispered, her voice thick with awe. This feeling. I've never experienced anything like it." The room fell silent again as Isa realized with growing horror that this wasn't an isolated event. This was a pattern. Every Zatorian who consumed human biological matter, whether it was saliva, sweat, or even blood, experienced the same overwhelming reaction. The addiction was real. Over the next few days, more and more Zatorians volunteered for the experiment, and each one fell victim to the same insatiable craving. It wasn't just the saliva that triggered the reaction. Human tears, sweat, and even blood had a similar effect. Each sample seemed to bring Zatorians into a euphoric, trance-like state. But as their cravings grew, so did their instability. It was clear now. The Zatorians were becoming addicted to humans, not just physically, but mentally as well. And Isa realized with growing dread that this addiction wasn't something they could easily reverse. It wasn't just a harmless curiosity anymore. It had the potential to tear apart everything the Zatorians had built. She had helped open a door to something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. A door that, once opened, might never close. One thing was certain. This was only the beginning. As the days passed, the situation grew more dangerous. Dr. Isa watched in horror as the Zatorians, once a controlled and rational species, began to lose their grip on themselves. The addiction to human biological samples had escalated quickly, and the consequences were even worse than she could have ever imagined. It started small, only a few volunteers, a handful of scientists, and the occasional soldier had taken part in the experiment. But the word quickly spread. Those who had consumed the human samples became desperate, obsessed with finding more. The craving was unlike anything the Zatorians had ever experienced before, and it was spreading faster than Isa could control it. In the streets of the Zatorian capital city, there were reports of random outbreaks. Zatorians, normally calm and disciplined, had begun attacking others, trying to take any human sample they could get. A drop of saliva, a hair from a human's head, anything they could find. They couldn't think of anything else. All they wanted was more. Isa paced back and forth in her laboratory, her mind racing. She had tried everything to reverse the effects. Medicine, therapy, even experimental treatments. But nothing worked. The addiction was too powerful, too deeply embedded in their biology now. It wasn't just a craving. It was a need. A primal, overwhelming urge to consume more of what made them feel human. The problem was far worse than anyone had anticipated. The Zatorians had not only become addicted to human samples, but to the very idea of experiencing life the way humans did. The craving for human emotion, human interaction, was beginning to take over their minds. They wanted to feel the joy and thrill that humans experienced every day, something the Zatorians had never been able to experience on their own. Isa knew that if the addiction continued to spread, it would tear their society apart. Entire families were now being torn apart by the need to feed the addiction. Zatorian leaders, once the most respected and powerful figures in their society, were now among the most dangerous. They were demanding that more humans be brought to Zatora for study, but Isa suspected it was more about feeding their own cravings. The humans were not safe. Dr. Isa's mind raced as she thought of a solution. She had no idea what would work, but she couldn't sit idly by. She couldn't let her species destroy itself because of a mistake they had made in their curiosity. She turned to her closest colleague, Torik, who had been one of the first scientists to volunteer for the human sample experiments. Torik had been one of the most vocal supporters of the research at first, but now even he seemed to be losing his composure. "Isa, this is getting out of hand," Torik said, his voice strained. He had dark circles under his eyes from sleepless nights spent studying the effects of the addiction. "We're no longer studying humans. We're becoming them. I'm not sure we can stop this. It's spreading too fast." "I know," Isa replied quietly, rubbing her temples. "But we have to try. If we don't stop this now, there won't be anything left of us. We'll become nothing more than slaves to this addiction. The humans will be gone, and we'll be left to destroy ourselves." Torik sighed and sat down at the table, his face drawn with exhaustion. "You're right. But how do we stop it? How can we undo something that's taken root so deeply in our biology? I don't think even our best scientists can figure that out." Isa stared at the holographic displays in front of her, which showed images of Zatorians in various stages of addiction. Their bodies were deteriorating. Their minds were becoming consumed by the need for more human contact. Some had started to become violent, even towards their own people. The addiction was no longer just a personal crisis, it was a societal one. It was affecting everything. "You're risking everything," Torik warned her. "They may not listen. And even if they do, they might decide to let this continue." "I can't live with that," Isa replied, her voice hard. "I didn't start this, but I will end it, even if it means losing everything." With a deep breath, Isa stood up. She had made her decision. She would go to the council, tell them the truth, and hope they would do the right thing. But she wasn't sure what would happen next. Would they agree to stop the research? Would they understand the severity of the situation? And if they didn't, what would become of her people? As Isa prepared to leave, the weight of her decision settled on her shoulders. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. The Zatorians could never go back to the way things were. Their desire for human pleasure had set them on a path that couldn't be undone. Now, all she could do was try to steer them away from the edge of destruction. Dr. Isa walked swiftly down the long, gleaming halls of the Zatorian Council's headquarters, her mind focused but her heart racing. Every step felt heavier, as though the weight of the universe was pressing down on her. She had never wanted to be in this position, never wanted to be the one to deliver such bad news. But the addiction spreading through her people was too dangerous to ignore. She had to make the council understand, or the entire Zatorian species might be lost. The walls around her seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't shake. It wasn't just the gravity of the moment. It was the sense that her people, who had once been the epitome of control and logic, were now teetering on the brink of chaos. The addiction to human biological matter had spread far beyond their expectations, and Isa knew it was only a matter of time before it was out of control. She arrived at the large, circular chamber where the council convened. The room was dark, the air thick with tension. The members of the council sat at their towering silver podiums, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Isa had always found them intimidating, but today the pressure felt overwhelming. At the center of the chamber, the High Counselor, Zorian, a tall and imposing figure, gestured for her to speak. "Dr. Isa," Zorian said, his voice deep and measured. "You requested an audience. We assume this is urgent. Speak, and make it quick." Isa took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She knew that the truth she was about to present would shock them, maybe even anger them. But there was no turning back now. The addiction was real, and it was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. The human samples. They caused an irreversible reaction in our species, Isa began, her voice steady but full of urgency. The saliva, sweat, and even the blood of humans have triggered a powerful craving in our bodies. We've seen it in every subject, and we've been unable to reverse it. It's not just curiosity. It's addiction. Our people are becoming dependent on it. The council members exchanged looks of disbelief. Isa could see their eyes flicker with confusion and surprise. They had never anticipated anything like this. To them, the idea that their own people could fall victim to such a basic biological need seemed absurd. "Are you suggesting that we are addicted?" Zorian asked slowly, his voice tinged with disbelief. "To a species we've barely even begun to understand." "Yes," Isa said firmly. "I've seen it. I've watched as our people have fallen into this desperation. It's not just physical. It's emotional. Zatorians, who have never experienced addiction, are now willing to do anything to satisfy their cravings. And it's spreading, Counselor. If we don't stop it, it could destroy us." The room fell into silence, the members of the council looking at each other with uncertainty. Isa's heart pounded as she waited for them to respond. What would they do? Would they listen to reason? Or would they dismiss her warnings? Finally, Zorian spoke again, his voice hard. And what do you propose we do, Dr. Isa? You are asking us to halt research that could revolutionize our understanding of biology. You're asking us to abandon our chance to experience what humans have. What would you have us do? Isa stood tall, trying to suppress the fear rising in her chest. She knew the stakes. We must stop the experiments. Immediately. We need to find a way to reverse the effects of this addiction before it consumes us entirely. If we continue, our people will lose control. We are already seeing violence, chaos, and even criminal behavior. If we don't act now, there will be no turning back. Another counselor, Nyla, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. Dr. Isa, your concerns are valid, but you underestimate the power of this discovery. The potential for advancing our species is immense. We have never encountered anything like this before. Perhaps it is not something to fear, but something to embrace. What if this addiction is the key to unlocking the new form of life? Isa's eyes widened in shock. Nyla's words were bold, and the other counselors seemed intrigued by the idea. They were not looking at this from the same angle she was. For them, the addiction was a fascinating opportunity, not a disaster. No, Isa said, her voice trembling with frustration. It's not an opportunity. It's a threat. You don't understand what it's like. These people, my people, they can't stop. They'll do anything to get more. They'll tear apart their own society to feed this addiction. We can't control it. We can't risk it. Zorian leaned forward, his glowing eyes narrowing. Then what do you suggest we do? Discard our chance at this breakthrough because of a few isolated incidents. Isa swallowed hard. She could feel the tension rising in the room. The council was divided, and the consequences of their decision would shape the future of their species. I propose that we halt all experiments immediately, she said firmly. We need to treat this as a crisis, not a curiosity. If we don't stop now, we risk everything. For a long moment, there was silence in the chamber. Finally, Zorian spoke, his voice cold and decisive. We will discuss your proposal further, Dr. Isa, but do not expect us to make decisions in haste. Isa nodded, but deep down, she knew that the council was not fully committed to stopping the research. The allure of the discovery was too great. They wouldn't let it go easily. As she left the chamber, Isa's thoughts were heavy. The addiction was out of control, and the council was divided. Time was running out, and her people were on the verge of losing everything. The battle to save the Zorians from their own desire for human pleasure had only just begun. The days following Isa's meeting with the Zorian Council felt like a blur. Every hour seemed to stretch longer, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away. The council's response had been cold, cautious, and filled with uncertainty. Isa had hoped for decisive action, but instead they had asked for more time. Time that the Zorians no longer had. The addiction to human biological matter was growing stronger, and the cracks in society were widening. Isa knew she couldn't wait for the council to act. If she didn't do something soon, her people would be lost. The once proud Zorian society was crumbling under the weight of their own desires, and every day that passed made it harder to reverse the damage. She sat in her lab, staring at the countless data screens in front of her. The numbers, the graphs, the reports, everything pointed to one horrifying conclusion. The addiction was spreading faster than anyone could have predicted. Zorians were becoming increasingly unstable, their behavior erratic. Some had even begun turning on each other in violent outbursts, all driven by the need for more human contact, more human biological samples. The worst part was that no one knew how far it would go. Would they stop at just a few samples, or would they begin hunting down humans, no matter the cost? Isa had seen how the addiction turned once calm Zorians into creatures of desperation, willing to do anything to get a taste of human emotion. She couldn't let that happen. Isa stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She couldn't keep waiting for a solution to fall from the sky. If the council refused to act, then it was up to her to fix this. She needed help, and not from the council. She needed help from the one place she had never considered before, the humans. Isa quickly gathered her notes and headed for the docking station, her mind racing. The human population on Zatora was small but growing, mostly as a result of trade and diplomatic missions. There was a group of humans living in a safe zone near the outskirts of the capital city. They had been kept mostly isolated from the Zatorians, their presence kept secret and controlled. But Isa had a plan. If she could get to them, maybe, just maybe, they could help her find a solution. The journey to the human settlement was long and tense. Isa couldn't stop thinking about the consequences of what she was doing. Was it right to involve humans in this? Was it fair to ask them to help fix something caused by her people's mistake? But the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was no other choice. If the Zatorians continued down this path, they would eventually destroy themselves and everything they had built. She arrived at the settlement just as the sun began to set, casting a soft orange glow across the horizon. The area was quiet, with only a few humans out and about, going about their business. Isa approached the main building where the human leaders were gathered, her heart pounding with nervous energy. Inside, the human representatives were seated around a large table, looking up as Isa entered. There was an air of caution in the room. She had never been this close to the humans before, and they hadn't seen many Zatorians outside the controlled areas. But Isa had no time for small talk. "I need your help," Isa said, her voice urgent. "I'm here because the Zatorians are in danger. We've made a terrible mistake. We've become addicted to your biological matter, your saliva, your blood, and we can't stop. It's spreading through our people like wildfire, and if we don't stop it, we will destroy ourselves." The human leaders exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to say. This was something they had never heard of before. Addiction. For the Zatorians, it was almost too strange to believe. We don't know how we can help," said one of the leaders, a woman named Clara. "We didn't do anything to cause this. How are we supposed to fix it?" "I know it's not your fault," Isa replied quickly, "but you have to understand. This addiction goes beyond biology. It's more than just physical cravings. Zatorians are losing their sense of control. They're becoming violent, desperate. If you don't help us, if we can't find a way to stop this, the consequences will be catastrophic for both of us." Clara stood up, her face filled with concern. "You're saying that the Zatorians could turn violent towards us?" Isa nodded grimly. "Yes. If this continues, there will be no stopping them. It's not just a few individuals anymore. It's becoming a movement. And as we speak, there are groups of Zatorians who are already beginning to search for humans to feed their addiction." The room fell silent as the human leaders absorbed the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a scientific crisis. This was a matter of survival for both species. And yet, Isa knew that the humans weren't fully prepared to deal with this kind of problem. No one was. "I don't know what we can do," Clara said finally, her voice soft. "But we'll help you. We have to." Isa's heart lifted slightly. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. She had managed to get the humans to agree to help. But now came the hard part, figuring out how they could reverse the addiction before it was too late. As she left the human settlement that night, Isa couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The Zatorians' addiction had taken hold too deeply, and the clock was ticking. The problem was bigger than anyone had realized, and there was no easy solution in sight. But as the stars twinkled overhead, Isa clung to one fragile hope. Maybe, just maybe, the humans held the key to saving them all. The alliance between Dr. Isa and the humans was fragile at best. She had hoped that their shared interest in saving both species would bring them together. But as the days passed, it became clear that the challenge they faced was much bigger than they had anticipated. Isa had spent hours in meetings with the human leaders, explaining the Zatorian addiction and what it was doing to their society. The humans, although shocked, were eager to help. They had never seen anything like it. an entire species driven to madness by a biological craving. But even with all their resources and knowledge, they had no real idea of how to stop it. The addiction was unlike anything the humans had ever encountered. The more they discussed, the more Isa felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Time was running out. Reports from the Zatorian capital city told of violent outbreaks, of groups of Zatorians attacking each other in search of human samples. The addiction was no longer a problem that could be contained in the labs. It was spilling out into every corner of society, and it was only a matter of time before it reached the human settlement. "Dr. Isa, we need to do something more," Clara said one afternoon, her tone sharp. "We're just sitting here talking about the problem. But the Zatorians are desperate. They're losing control, and they could come for us any moment." Isa sighed deeply, rubbing her forehead. "I know, but what else can we do? We don't even understand how this addiction works. We don't even know if it can be cured." Clara crossed her arms, frustration evident in her eyes. "Maybe we don't need to cure it. Maybe we just need to find a way to break the cycle, to stop them from craving more. You're a scientist, right? Surely there's something we're missing." Isa turned to the holographic display in front of her, showing the data she and her team had been collecting. Graphs of Zatorian behavior, levels of addiction, and the various stages of their symptoms. She had spent hours trying to find a pattern, a clue that would lead to a solution. But so far, nothing had worked. Every time they thought they had a breakthrough, the addiction only grew stronger. "I wish it were that simple," Isa said softly. "But every test we run shows that the craving isn't just physical. It's psychological too. The Zatorians don't just need the biological samples. They need the experience of being human. The emotions, the sensations. They've become obsessed." Clara looked at her for a long moment, her brow furrowed in thought. Then she spoke again, her voice low. "What if we could give them what they need without using humans? What if we could mimic the biological effects in some way, create an artificial substitute?" Isa's eyes widened. It was an idea she hadn't considered. Could they really replicate the effects of human biology without the risk of human involvement? It seemed far-fetched, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. If they could create a synthetic version of the biological material that the Zatorians craved, it might just be the answer. "We'd need to study human biology even more closely," Isa said, pacing the room. "We'd need to identify exactly what it is in human saliva, blood, and tissue that triggers this reaction in the Zatorians. But it could work. If we can create a substitute, we could cut off the Zatorians' addiction without risking the lives of any more humans." Clara nodded. "It sounds risky, but it's worth trying. We need to isolate the exact compound that triggers the addiction and see if we can synthesize it in the lab." Isa felt a spark of hope. Finally, they had a potential solution. But as she looked at the map of Zator on the screen, her heart sank. The Zatorian government, led by those addicted to human biological matter, would never allow this plan to succeed without resistance. There would be those who saw the artificial substitute as an affront to their newfound craving, and they might fight back, violently. "Even if we create a substitute, we still need to get it to the people who need it," Isa said, her voice quiet with concern. "The government will try to stop us. They'll see this as a threat to their control." Clara's expression hardened. "Then we fight back. If the Zatorians won't let us help, we'll have to find a way around them. We can't sit back and watch them destroy themselves, and us, with their addiction." Isa felt a shiver run down her spine. The idea of conflict between the two species was terrifying. She had never wanted things to escalate to this point. She had come to the humans in search of a solution, not to start a war. But the longer the Zatorians resisted, the more desperate they would become. And as their addiction grew, their rationality would continue to fade. "What happens if we can't make the substitute in time?" Isa asked, her voice barely a whisper. Clara looked at her seriously. "Then we'll have to take a different route. but I'm not going to let the Zatorians wipe us out, or themselves. Isa nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. She was in this now. There was no going back. They had to act quickly, but every move they made carried immense risks. As she left the meeting room that day, Isa's mind was racing with possibilities. They had a plan, but there was no guarantee it would work. And the Zatorians, desperate and violent, were closing in. Time was running out. The battle to save both species had only just begun. The synthetic solution was ready. After weeks of research, testing, and refining, Dr. Isa and the human scientists had finally created a chemical compound that could mimic the addictive properties of human biological samples without the risk of using real human tissue. It was a breakthrough, but it came with its own set of challenges. Would the Zatorians accept it? Would it be enough to break the dangerous cycle of addiction that had taken hold of their species? The tension in the air was thick. As the news spread through the human settlement, a small group of Zatorians had already infiltrated the area, desperate for more of the human samples they craved. The attacks were becoming more frequent, more violent. Isa knew they didn't have much time left. The Zatorians' addiction was spiraling out of control, and unless they could deliver the cure, no, the substitute, soon, there might be nothing left to save. "We can't wait any longer," Isa said to Clara as she paced back and forth in the small lab. "If we don't get this to the people soon, the addiction will destroy everything." Clara nodded, looking at the vials of the synthetic compound on the table in front of them. "You're right, but we still need to find a way to deliver it to the Zatorians without them rejecting it. This isn't going to be easy." Isa stopped pacing and looked at the vials. "We've been testing it with a few volunteers, but so far, the results have been promising. It seems to satisfy their craving, though we can't be sure how long the effects will last." Clara crossed her arms. "You said they're getting more desperate. What happens if they don't get the substitute in time? How far will they go?" Isa's face hardened. "They'll do anything. The addiction has already driven them to violence. They're willing to sacrifice anything to get their fix, even if it means attacking other Zatorians or humans. If we don't stop them now, this could turn into an all-out war." The sound of a loud crash echoed through the building, followed by the heavy thud of footsteps. Isa's heart skipped a beat. The Zatorians had arrived. A group of them, their eyes wild with hunger and desperation, had broken into the human settlement, searching for the biological samples they craved. They would never stop until they got what they wanted. "We need to act now," Isa said urgently, grabbing the vials of the synthetic solution and shoving them into a secure case. "Let's get to the distribution center. We'll inject the substitute into the air supply. It'll reach the Zatorians in the capital and surrounding areas within hours." Clara nodded, already gathering her things. "Let's move." The two women rushed out of the lab, making their way through the chaotic streets of the settlement. Zatorians, once calm and composed, now ran wild, their faces twisted in anger and desperation. The humans were struggling to hold back the onslaught, but Isa could see that they were outnumbered. The Zatorians were no longer just looking for human samples. They were looking for a way to feed their addiction, and they would stop at nothing to get it. As they reached the distribution center, Isa and Clara were met by a team of human soldiers, ready to help with the task at hand. The soldiers were on edge, but they knew what needed to be done. The compound had to be released into the air supply before the Zatorians could breach the facility. "Is everything ready?" Isa asked, looking at the technician who was overseeing the operation. "Almost," the technician replied, his voice tense. "We've set up the diffusion system. Once we inject the compound, it will spread through the entire capital in less than an hour. But you need to be ready. If the Zatorians don't take to it, if they reject it." "I know," Isa said, her voice tight with fear. "This is our only chance." With a final nod, the technician activated the system, and Isa watched as the synthetic compound began to disperse into the air. It was a risky move, but it was their only hope. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Isa and Clara stood by, watching the monitors, their breath held in anticipation. Outside, the sounds of shouting and chaos continued as the Zatorians fought to break through. But in the distance, something strange began to happen. The Zatorians slowed. Their frantic movements began to ease, their expressions softening. It was as if they were no longer consumed by the violent craving that had driven them to madness. "I think it's working," Clara said, her voice filled with disbelief. "It's actually working." Isa could hardly believe it herself. For the first time in weeks, there was hope. The synthetic compound seemed to be calming the Zatorians, quelling their need for human biological matter. As the minutes passed, the aggression in the streets began to subside, and the once frenzied Zatorians seemed to regain control of themselves. But the victory wasn't guaranteed yet. The addiction was powerful, and it had taken deep root in the Zatorians' minds. It would take time for them to adjust fully. Isa knew that this was just the beginning. The substitute had worked for now, but they needed a long-term solution, something that could keep the Zatorians from falling into addiction again. "We've bought ourselves some time," Isa said, turning to Clara. "But we can't stop here. We need to find a permanent cure, something that doesn't rely on substitutes." Clara nodded. "We'll keep working. Together." The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, Isa felt a glimmer of hope. Humanity and the Zatorians had come together to face a crisis, and they had survived. But as the night settled over the city, Isa knew the true challenge lay ahead. The road to recovery would be long, and the dangers were far from over. But for now, they had won the first battle.